Today, I am going to be talking about the 11th chapter in Tralek Rinpoche's book, How to Do Life. And this one is emotions, self-interest, and the role of judgments. To start out with, he mentions that emotions are composed of different parts and that we have strong feelings and cognitive activity combining. In other words, in our mind, we have these strong feelings, and then we have cognitive activity, and we are bringing information from the outside of us into this process of experiencing emotions and emotionality. The cognitive activity includes things like reasoning, judging, thinking, conceptual sorts of things, and we add all sorts of things to our sensory perceptions. And that there's always judgment, and it's always based on self-interest. Here's a quote from page 136. Whatever is non-pleasurable is non-pleasurable to one's own sense of identity or ego. So ego is the judge about what is pleasurable and what isn't pleasurable. Everything we experience is judged by how comfortable we are or how comfortable our ego is. Ego thinks, is this a threat to me, a threat to the false belief that I am a solid person? It isn't that this kind of arguing goes on constantly. It happens very quickly, and he's putting it into words for us to understand. You don't necessarily have this conversation with yourself about these things. In fact, he says that we may not even be aware of this process most of the time because it happens so quickly and it's been going on for our whole lives. So we use ego to judge everything to determine whether it's a threat or if it is a friend, you might say, if it can be used. We experience everything on this basis of self or ego. Here he's using them interchangeably. And these judgments are connected or related to our emotional responses that we can have. At this point of the book, he's keeping it very simple. And he says that we can have anger and fear or joy and happiness, which arises, depends on our judging of whatever it is that has arisen into our lives, that we will judge it. And if we do not like what we make contact with, then we can lean towards the side of anger, aversion, and so forth. Or if it is something that we might find pleasurable, we would have the opposite reaction. But either way, it's ego that makes the judgment on whether what arises is a friend or a foe. So there's always judgment behind all of our emotions. And he points out that the friends can become foes and foes can become friends. It's a very fluid process, actually. He then goes on to say that a lot of people look at Buddhist meditation as a way to manage their emotions. He feels that there's something much more important than that, and that is instead of managing our emotions, that it's possible to break free of them. The proper use of meditation is to calm your mind down and then be more curious about the process of these emotions arising and then dwelling for a while and then disappearing. Get to know them. You could say get to know how they taste and they feel and so forth. If we have this background information, it becomes much easier to free ourselves from being bound by our emotions. It's also good, he mentions, to look and see, does this particular emotion uplift me, or does it demean me or people around me? or whoever the object of the emotion is. It talks about the object of emotions and the cause of emotions. And these are two very closely related terms, but they are slightly different. He brings in David Hume, the British philosopher, and he made this distinction between cause of the emotion and the object of the emotion. So the object of an emotion can change, and frequently it does. One person can bring out love in us, and then on a different day, that person might bring out hate in us. So you have two emotions in one person. Also, the object of emotion can be a person or a thing that you hate or like. Again, the object is usually something that we can detect with our five sense organs. And then it can also be our consciousness, our sixth consciousness, which is where these emotions reside, so to speak. And in terms of an object of emotion being a perceptual object, he talks about you see somebody or you hear somebody and you have a train of thoughts about that person. And then you conclude, in his words, there is danger. And your body reacts physically to this danger. And then your mind reacts to this, and you have full blown fear and very strong reactions. He says if there are no perceptual objects, we still can have strong reactions. And this is because of our very good imagination. We might think we are in a terrible situation or could get into a terrible situation, that something might happen, and we keep thinking about it all day long, all week long, a whole month long, and whatever. And we kind of work ourselves up to an emotional, what would I say, an emotional wreck. I believe that would be a good way to describe it. Our minds are agitated, we're worrying. Your body is actually exhibiting physical symptoms, like maybe it's difficult for you to get to sleep, difficult to get out of bed in the morning, and many other things. And of course, the bizarre point is that when you start thinking about what could happen in the future, I would guess that most of the time it never happens, but you still suffered as if it did happen. He uses the term active imagination for going back into the past and dwelling on things that have happened in the past and developing a lot of strong emotional responses to what has happened in the past. And he said it's usually or frequently when you go back into the past, you're running into a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety rather than thinking about a lot of wonderful, great times you've had in the past. To continue now, he says there's a large variety of physical and mental factors that produce the object of the emotion. Already, we have this variety. It's not solid. There are many different causes and conditions. And these mental factors can produce physical reactions in our body. He said that, for instance, fear can cause a lump in the throat, a rise in body temperature, increased pulse, more beats per minute for the heart. It can create a different breathing pattern, breathing shallow and quickly. Quote, a suite of physical responses is associated with all emotions, positive or negative, end quote. And that's a suite as in SUITE. So it's good to look into the many elements that comprise our emotional life and to understand how complex this is. The more we know about it, the weaker our emotional upheavals become. By looking into it, we can encourage insight, seeing more clearly than before what's actually going on in our minds. In a way, to get to know our emotions, to make friends with our emotions and not be afraid of them or grasping onto them if it's a pleasant emotion. So being able to see with clarity what's going on in your mind is really very, very important. And this is the way we kind of tame our mind and these conflicting emotions. Now, these emotions, from the point of perception of an external object or an internal object to becoming full blown, it's not a linear process. It comes from many different causes and conditions, and it's unpredictable. And there's many different emotions that we can experience besides attachment to pleasurable experiences and aversion to unpleasant circumstances. Other people can bring out shame in ourselves. For instance, you see somebody doing something and they're really good at it, or you feel that they are behaving better than you are, and you can become ashamed of your what you perceived as worse behavior than the other person, or feel badly about I should be able to be make these things as good as that person makes them, whether it be painting, drawing, maybe decorating a house on the inside, whatever. There's just so many things that we can feel ashamed about. And we're bouncing off another person, of course. That's a big part of the emotions, is bringing a second person in and then comparing. A subculture can bring specific expectations with it. And on this basis alone, we can develop all kinds of things. Interesting to compare the way the Chinese culture views parents versus in the United States. And it's not just China, it would be in all of these Asian countries that parents are considered very, very special and very, very important and worthy of respect, the greatest respect. In our country, here in the United States, there is all kinds of clues, whether it be in the movies, in the ads, on social media, or whatever, that you have to break free of your parents. And a lot of times your parents are the problem. When you start getting these two cultures mixed up, let's say the children of a first generation immigrant, where they start to take on American culture, that can cause all kinds of inner turmoil. So input from others, also their values, their expectations. Besides that, we have hidden agendas in our emotions, expectations of others, and others have expectations of us, and it gets very, very complicated, very complex. Now, our emotions and the impact they have on us hinges on our expectations of an individual or a group, or perhaps even a whole society, that we've internalized all of this. And this, again, is another factor or group of factors that influence our emotions, how we view them, how we respond to others. Some people will, for whatever reason, when they enter a new situation or something arises, will expect the worst to happen, or they may, on the other hand, lean the other direction and expect that this is going to be just wonderful and fantastic. So all of this is included in the heading of causes and conditions. On page 141, here is a quote. Sometimes it can be challenging and sometimes very difficult to regulate, modify, train, or educate our emotional responses. But just because it's difficult doesn't mean that we can't do it. In Tibetan Buddhism, there are the 7 points of mind training, and that works on these causes and conditions. It's actually a very powerful set of tools that help you overcome selfish tendencies, your egotistical tendencies, and so forth. So this is one way to work with them using the 7 points of mind training. It's also important to remember that you can choose to respond differently, that you're not a slave to your emotions, you're not a slave to your karma, that you hold the key to get out. And a good part of it is understanding how everything works. Because when you understand how it works, you kind of watch how it builds up and strengthens. And then at some point, it loses its momentum and it disappears. So he then brings in this Sanskrit name, this samskara, Samskara. And this is very simply a habitual response. We have accumulated many habitual responses. They seem normal or natural to us. And frequently, we feel that there's no other possible way of responding than responding using a habitual pattern. But if we see how our mind works, it becomes easier to change. If we look deeply and see how one thing leads to another, and another, we can try something new. And it's always possible to go in a new direction because we do have that ability. We're not slaves to our habitual patterns. So all of this complicated mechanism feels very solid. It feels very natural. On the other hand, it's not solid. It's made out of very many parts, and the parts are made up of smaller parts. When you start seeing this, you can work with the smaller parts and not feel overwhelmed because it becomes more manageable. Popped into my mind, it's a bit like doing the dishes. You don't wash all the dishes at once, you wash them one at a time. And eventually, you've got a pile of clean dishes. To go on, he says that we need to take care of ourselves. Karmapa says compassion for oneself is renunciation. So we need to look inward and see how we cause our own suffering with these samskaras, these habitual patterns. And then to realize that we created them and we can change or dismantle them. Again, they're made out of parts and pieces. So we're not predestined to live our present life in a state of hopeless depression, maybe. We're not hopeless. We're not helpless. We actually have a lot of inner resources. And through Buddhism, we get a lot of external resources as well. The present moment is full of opportunities, and it is a present moment where we can make decisions and change our behavior and go in a new direction. So just by making little changes in the present moment, we start weakening these habitual patterns. Then we have dependent arising or interdependence. That's what he meant by the present moment. In the present moment, there are many possibilities, directions that you can go in, words that you can say. And if we can learn how to maintain some clarity of our minds and learn how to see that these emotions are not solid, we can change in the present. It turns out that we have installed these buttons that we think other people push, and we can learn to uninstall them. We don't have to change everybody else that we come in contact with. We can just disconnect these buttons and then they don't get pushed. And this means that we can free ourselves from emotional servitude. The thing is, if your emotions control you, that means if another person or another entity can control your emotions or one of your emotions, they can control you. This is a very important point about working on weakening your emotions, your negative emotions, so that others can't control you and that you can learn to control yourself and be happier. The bottom line is that that will make you happier as well. We need to be aware of how we are using our emotions and the motivation behind our emotions. Again, our emotions are a product of many different elements. And frequently, there's a lot of drama with the emotions. And they're emotional expressions that involve self deception, deceiving others, strategies, and so forth. If we listen to our inner voice, our inner critic, it's like a soap opera going on inside of our minds. People can use emotional blackmail, or we could use emotional blackmail. Things like in a marriage relationship, going silent, being mad at your partner, and then just going silent and not saying anything, with the point being that you want them to change their mind, or you want them to feel pain, that you want to inflict some pain on them. If we can see these patterns, see this process, see the mechanism, we can change our habits and go in a much better direction. I once dined with Kempo Carter Rinpoche and got a fortune cookie, and I opened up the fortune cookie, and the fortune read, "To see your drama is to be liberated from it." And that's really what is being talked about here. If we can see our drama as drama, you drop it. You realize it's just drama. That we can see the different elements. We can see the emotional experiences, the subject, the object, all these schemas, planning, propensities, judgments, and on and on and on, and realize that they're all dependent on each other and that they're not solid. And if there is an external object, it has many different facets, many different sides to who they are, even if they don't know it. So now he talks about our consciousness and the subject. Here's a quote, it's a long quote. Objectively speaking, our social environment, other people, situations, physical things, objects, and so on, all constitute our emotional life. The feelings, thoughts, and attitudes combined with our conscious experiences as a conscious subject with our own self-awareness as a living conscious being who can say, I have this experience of that emotion. Somebody who has a body that generates feelings and physical reactions. Now, I think it's good to unpack this, but I thought it was also good to go to this particular very complicated sentence. He talks about our social environment, and that brings in lots of information, lots of associations, relationships, and so forth. And then other people, other situations, physical objects, and on and on and on. It's a very long list of things that influence our emotions. He uses the term emotional life. So with that emotional life, then we have these feelings, thoughts, certain attitudes, and then he uses conscious a number of times here. Our conscious experiences, the experiences that we are aware of as a conscious subject, that we are aware of the object of this interaction or this emotion. We are aware of the emotion itself. And then he goes on to say, with our own self-awareness as a living conscious being. So we are aware of ourselves. We're aware that we are alive and that we are aware that we're having this strong emotion. And he finishes up by saying that the person, this conscious person, could say that I have this experience of that emotion because you've probably experienced it many, many times, reruns of that emotion. So now this is codependence. All of these things arise together, not separately. Unfortunately, they produce all kinds of suffering. He lists fears, anxiety, worry, stress, all of the negative emotions. These emotional experiences are felt in the body and influence the body, but that the body is not independent, that the body requires consciousness if it's going to transcend the material realm. So the body is influenced by the mind, and the mind is influenced by the body, but the mind is supreme. Tralag Rinpoche says that actually thinking of mind and body cause people to think that they are separate things when in fact they are not. They are acting as a unit. He said it's better to see them as the dharmas interacting. Quote, a variety of physical and mental factors that are intact. Now I'm going to start the 12th chapter, and this is titled The Omnipresent Mental Factors and the Primary and Secondary Emotions. So we meditate in order to learn to deal with and work with our emotions in a meditative setting. Meditation calms our mind down, and this allows us to see more clearly and understand our emotional map better. And this helps improve the quality of our lives. There's no question about that. If you wonder why we meditate, it improves the quality of our lives off the cushion. And as Buddhists, we want to learn to lead a life that is meaningful, complete, satisfying, and fulfilling. Those are Tralek Rinpoche's words. In order to do that, we have to get a grip on our emotional life. The quality of one's life improves when we are skilled at regulating, modifying, and dealing with our disturbing emotional experiences in all of their variety. On the other hand, if you don't, it just becomes more of the same old, that we might not like what we keep running into, but since we do not know how we create it, we don't know how to avoid creating it in the future. The Buddha said that we have lots of emotional experiences and that this doesn't mean that we are mentally ill. It means that we have a psychological problem. And this reminded me of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who would tell his students, you're all neurotic, and that the Buddhist path is working with your neurosis. So it's not saying that we're mentally ill, it's just saying that we are confused. But we can address these problems in a way where we can reduce it. At the present time, we get tied up in an emotion and we lose our perspective. And it becomes way more important than it needs to be. And we can't distinguish between what is important and what is trivial. Again, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche would talk about having an aerial view, like up on a drone, where you can see a bigger picture. So we need to distinguish between what is trivial, what is important, and that takes wisdom. And it's important to do this because life moves very quickly and it can be squandered. In a way, you could say life is too precious to squander. So we need to be wiser in choosing which emotions we want to dominate our lives. He says, you want to be happy? Well, then cultivate emotions that bring happiness that is lasting. If you're not happy before you get what you want, you're not going to be happy after you get what you want, at least not for long. So you need to pay attention to what gives you lasting happiness and what is very temporary, and put your effort into having lasting happiness. Again, a common response to I'm not happy, what I need to do is just do more of the same thing and eventually it'll work and I'll be happy. To counteract that, we'll learn to be more discerning and to make better decisions through our wisdom, encourage positive thoughts, and work with negative ones more skillfully. It can be as simple as just letting go of negative thoughts. When you find that you are having negative thinking, just let go of it. If you need to, just start counting the out breath like you're meditating. With practice, we can learn to be more skillful at letting go of negative emotions and spotting negative emotions as they begin to gather strength. And if we realize that these negative emotions are a serious problem, that also helps us let go of them. It's good to contemplate how anger can really destroy one's happiness. If you're angry, you can't be happy, and the people around you are going to be having a more difficult time. They can't be happy when you're angry. They may want to leave the room or not invite you again. But if we can see more clearly these negative moods, we can weaken our attachment to them. He talks about depression too in this section, and that even depression can weaken, and you can have fewer bouts of depression by seeing how things work and weakening your attachment. He then talks about the Abhidharma. What this means is Abhi means to make manifest, to make something that is hidden obvious, and Dharma means mental and physical factors. There are a lot of different meanings to the word Dharma, by the way. It's also used to explain the teachings of the Buddha. So, what Abhidharma means is teachings that make the hidden mental and physical factors obvious. He mentions that the most important work is the Abhidharma Kosha, which means a treasury of Abhidharma. These teachings are given to help you understand your negative states of mind and then get a handle on them. I like that phrase, get a handle on them. The more you know about them, the less of a problem they are. He then goes on to talk about the 5 omnipresent mental factors. And these factors must be present if you're going to have an emotional response and an emotional experience, whether it be a positive one or a negative one. The first one is feeling. He said tone also would work here. And this means to both physical and mental feeling. Feeling pain, pleasure, and he uses the term numbness. And he defines that numbness state as a state of not experiencing pain or pleasure. It is not zoning out, meditating, and just going to a place where you're not even aware that you're in the room, but it is just this not experiencing pain and not experiencing pleasure. So it's a neutral state. And we distinguish between pain and pleasure with our mind after we get this input from our 5 senses, as well as from our 6th sense, the mental consciousness. The next factor is cognition, and this is recognizing an object, cognizing the sensory object. You start seeing details of the object. Another term for this would be distinguishing awareness. The next factor is intentionality or mental impulse. It would be like saying to yourself, I will. You have an intention to get involved with this, an impulse. The next is rapport or contact. This means a focused grasping of an object of awareness, where the physical and the mental factors come together very strongly and focused. And finally is ideation. And here you formed an opinion of what you have received. There is a judgment, and then we go into having emotions about this. The last sentence in that particular part of the chapter goes to emphasize and reiterate. In Abhidharma literature, it is considered these 5 must be present in order for us to have any positive or negative experiences, a complete experience of emotions.